thank you very much for coming tonight. And I'm very, very moved to be tonight here at Book Passage because in a way, for me, this is like a circle that closes beautifully, a circle that started many years ago. Sasha Chanoff became one of my heroes, and I don't have very many of those, several years ago when he was not famous. He had not been in 60 Minutes. He had not talked to President Obama yet. Refuge Point, the incredible organization that he has founded, didn't exist yet. When I met Sasha, he was a kid. He was a kid with an innocent face, a huge heart, and the fierce purpose to save the most needy and desperate human beings in the planet. He wasn't even married, and I thought that he would never find time or find someone who would be willing to compete with Sasha's passion for service. But he did. He has a lovely wife and 2 kids, and they all live in Massachusetts. Sasha was born in Finland in 1971. For God's sake, he could be my grandson. Many of Sasha's relatives died in the Holocaust. So I think that he has in his genes the understanding of what it means to be a refugee, to have no place in the world. Sasha graduated from, I can never pronounce this name, Wesleyan University? Well, something like that. Has a master's degree in humanitarian assistance from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He was awarded the Charles Bronfman Prize in 2010 for humanitarian efforts and the Gleitzman International Activist Award in 2013 for a leader who works to challenge injustice. Other recipients have been Nelson Mandela and Ralph Nader. He's in good company. Well, I could spend the evening listing you Sasha's accomplishments, but you've come to listen to what he has to say, which is very, very moving. So I'm leaving out all the information. Please Google him, because you'll find there what I don't have to say now. Don't wait. As soon as we finish here, you Google him in your phone. When we met Sasha, he told me the story of Rose Mapendo, a Tutsi widow with 7 children and newly born premature twins that she carried around her chest in a tomato bag. She had been for 16 months in a death camp. The plight of that woman and others like her set Sasha on fire. He has dedicated his life to rescue and resettle refugees, to help them find their relatives somewhere in the world, work with immigration authorities in countries such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and other countries, to get medical help, food, you name it. Sasha has been able to evacuate 30,000 refugees from Sudan, Kenya, Burundi, and Congo. He saved 3,500 boys from Sudan and 89 girls. And this is just a sample. The numbers are astonishing. Thousands and thousands of men, women, and children owe Refuge Point, and Sasha in particular, their lives. I think that for most of us, it's almost impossible to imagine the conditions in which these people that you rescued lived. And that's why the image is so important. I hope that we can see this on TV or somewhere. Is it going to be public?
It will be. The video will be public, I think, sometime in the next couple of weeks. We're not certain exactly where it'll show up, but it will be public. So I'll let you know, and I'll let you all know.
Let us know.
Yeah.
We need to link it, or I don't know. People need to see this, especially now when we are talking about immigration and refugees all over. I'm so moved. I'm sorry. It's just devastating.
Isabel, can I say something also just about the video? That this video highlights the Congo in its worst moments in history, but we have to recognize that Congo is a country that's rich in diversity, in culture, in people who love the country, with business opportunities. So this is just one aspect of the Congo that you've seen. And that's not how Congo is. It's a rich place with a lot of diversity and a lot of extraordinarily positive things and people who are there, and I think that's important to recognize.
Yeah, but it's also important to know that people that have lives can end up like this. And that is what's happening for so many refugees from Syria and from Afghanistan, people who had a normal life, and they end up like this. I remember that when we met, you talked to me about Rose Mapendo. Tell me the story.
Rose was one of the widows in that tent. She, along with all the others, came here to the U.S.
No, but start from the beginning. You are not a storyteller. Start from the beginning. How did she look? Who was she?
She was a Congolese woman who had gone through the experience that we talk about here. She was in a prison camp with other relatives and family members. She lost her husband. She watched other people lose their lives. She then gave birth to twins in this prison camp.
I remember you told me that she named the twins after the commander in the camp.
And she, to try to keep them alive, she named them after the commander in the camp. And it did not look like they would survive or anybody would survive. But very miraculously, and we tell the story in the book, they got into this safe haven a couple of days before we arrived there. So she and others were the ones that we met in that tent. Mammy Najurama, whom you saw in the video, was another person in that tent. She was 15 years old, and she was the oldest of 7 children and was taking care of her younger siblings in the most extreme conditions.
Wow. The subtitle of your book is Finding Your Moral Center Through the Toughest Decisions. And you begin telling the story of that tough decision with this, which we saw in this movie. Do you think that we are all sooner or later confronted with tough decisions? Or it was just your karma?
My situation was certainly unique, but in the book we highlight other people's stories from the military, from healthcare, from the humanitarian field, who all face their own moral decision points. And the idea in the book is that while my situation was unique, all of us at one point or another are going to face a decision that impacts other people's lives in some significant way. And there will be a lot of factors at play in those decisions. And when we can tune into our own core of who we are and our own humanitarian values, that can help guide our decisions. But what we do in the book is we lay out principles around these kinds of decisions, 5 different principles that can help you think about how to make these sorts of decisions. What I found personally was that this experience changed my life. It opened my eyes to other refugees who were off the radar, who were unseen by the humanitarian community. So, for example, when I was working in Kakuma refugee camp with a group known as the Sudanese Lost Boys, who were orphan children who had escaped violence miraculously in South Sudan and found their way to this refugee camp in Kenya and were en route to come to the U.S., I found there were many unaccompanied girls or orphan girls who shared the exact same story, and yet they weren't on the resettlement lists. They were overlooked because they were hidden in the camp. People who were caring for them kept them at home, where they had to do the house chores, and then they were sold into marriage against their will when they hit the age of 14 or 15 years old. And so these girls were overlooked. I found situation after situation like that, and after this experience in the Congo, I felt that because I was in a position to do something, I had to, and yet I didn't see that the organizations in the world were actually addressing those people who fell through the cracks of assistance. And that's why Refuge Point came into existence, to find and protect those people who were voiceless and unseen and unheard and in the most desperate situations.
You mentioned that there are 5 points that, can you say what they are?
Yeah. The first principle is to be prepared. to know that at some point we will face a decision that will have an impact on others. If we're prepared, then we'll be ready to open our eyes to that decision. For me, opening my eyes was actually stepping into that tent. I was very lucky to have Sheikha there with me, who's really my hero. If she wasn't there, I wouldn't have stepped into that tent. I wouldn't have opened my eyes to that situation. The third principle is to confront yourself. Even when you open your eyes to a decision, you have to determine what's the right thing for you to do. And sometimes you need to argue with somebody about that. Sheikha was the one who confronted me and helped me look into what I felt I had to do. The fourth principle is to know yourself. Once you argue or you have that kind of confrontation, look deep inside. See who you are as a human being. What motivates you? What does your family history tell you? What does your teaching tell you? But even with those four principles, you might not be ready to make a decision because decisions, all hard decisions, have consequences. So the fifth principle is to take courage. Take courage to do what you feel is the right thing for you to do. So we lay those out and we highlight other stories where people have faced hard decisions and have used those kinds of principles to help determine what they do. But the thing is that these kinds of choices can help change our lives. I think it's very easy to kind of keep our head down in our work, in our studies, raising our families, and we don't often look up and around us to decisions that might be around us. But if you do, that has the potential to change you and to deepen your own sense of who you are and your sense of, I think, connection with others.
Not only your stories are very moving, I mean, extremely moving, but also the writing of the book. I know that you wrote it with your father, David Chanoff. Can you read a little bit? Did you write that part that you're going to read, or your dad did?
my dad is really, I would say, the intellectual architect of this book. He's a writer who's written 20 books. He was not with me in the Congo, but when I was there, I felt the need to write to him and my mom because while this was a new experience for me, I knew it was a new experience for them as parents who had a child in a place of significant danger. And so, but it was a very complicated rescue mission, and the Congolese government had bugged our room and was probably monitoring our emails. And so my mom is from Finland, and I was born there, and so I wrote emails in Finnish to my parents. My dad learned Finnish, so hoping that nobody would understand those. And so from the start, my dad was along my side during this. So we wrote this book together. Just to summarize briefly, Sheikha and I, after we met those widows and orphans in that tent, we had a decision to make about whether or not we would take them or leave them behind. We knew that taking them would risk the lives of the 112 people that were on our list and that had been approved for departure. But we knew that leaving them behind would mean most likely their death. And so this part starts with me and Sheikha arguing. I knew I was throwing down the gauntlet with Sheikha. I knew Sheikha. I knew what was inside her head, but I didn't know everything. I definitely knew I couldn't see this situation properly. I felt completely inadequate to do that, to weigh the value of lives like this. But David could. Who better? I'd been working with him for 6 months now, ever since I arrived in Africa. I had never met anyone so competent, so grounded, so cool in his judgments. Maybe I wasn't up to making this decision here, but he was. He'd been involved in this kind of thing for years, life and death resting on his shoulders. Maybe I didn't know what to do, but David was a lodestar I could follow, besides being my boss. But Sheikha had her own ideas. Here's Sheikha again, looking back on that night. So this is Sheikha speaking. All the way back from the protection center in Kinshasa, my head was spinning. I was watching Sasha, thinking about how to fight with him. How can we leave them? I had to do that. It wasn't to disrespect Sasha, it was a way to start it going. That night at the hotel, I was fighting with Sasha about taking the widows and orphans. When it got to be too overwhelming, I would rush to the bathroom and cry. I would talk to the mirror, practicing how I could speak to him without being too emotional. I didn't want to show that I was hysterical or overwhelmed. I wanted to convince him. I would cry and then compose myself, but I was dying inside. I was burning inside. I went back again and again and talked to the mirror. I asked God, please give me strength so that when I talk, I won't sound like a useless emotional person not making good judgments, so he'll see that what I'm saying makes sense. Eating, we couldn't eat. Sleeping, we couldn't sleep. I understood that Sasha had to respect his orders from David. And even though he felt what I was feeling, he had strict instructions. So what was going to persuade him? What was the best way to handle this? I said to him, if this is not for them, then who is this for? What are we here for? Are we humanitarians or are we not? Then this is me writing. We didn't sleep. We talked and talked. Sheikha's bottom line was compassion. You do everything you can for those in need. You put yourself on the line for them. You do not give up no matter what, even if it means you yourself might go down with the ship. That's where she was coming from with the women and children in that tent. We might end up with a disaster on our hands. She wasn't disregarding the lives we might lose and what that would mean for us personally. I could just imagine the regret, the guilt, the awful psychological consequences. But that didn't mean we could give up on women and children who so desperately needed us. Are we humanitarians or are we not? That got to me. It crushed every defense I had left. Am I a humanitarian or am I not? Was I a human being committed to the welfare of his fellow human beings? What were my own instincts telling me, the bottom line of my own nature? Not what David Gergen was telling me, not what some rational moral calculus was saying about weighing this quantity of lives against that quantity. That's what dawned on me as the hours went by, and that's where I finally ended up. Okay, I told Sheikha finally, let's figure out a way to take them.
What was the way to take them? How did you take them out?
Well, we had to go to the Congolese immigration authorities and say that we had another group that we needed to take out. And they said to us, well, you told us that the list was closed, so we need you to take additional people that we have that we feel need to be evacuated too. And we said, okay. So they added other people to our list. And then on our last night, we realized that we had too many people for our flight. We had 126 seats, but now we had over 150 people on our flight. But then we thought we can change the birth dates of all the kids who are 4 and 3 years old and make them under 2 so they can sit on laps of adults. And so I spent the night doing that. And the next morning, we boarded everybody from the compound onto buses, and we had armed guards for each bus because on a previous rescue operation, a bus had broken down and a mob had gathered around it, and armed guards had surrounded the bus, and they barely got out of there before the mob attacked. So we finally got to the airport, and as we started trying to bring people off the bus, the Congolese immigration authorities stopped us. And I thought, everything that David said is coming true. He said, well, if we try to do this, we'll fail and we won't get anybody out. And then I saw Sheikha go and talk to the head of Congolese immigration. And I think she said something about how these are women and children. We had also hired everybody to support us.
That means bribe them.
Yes.
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 Of course.
And they finally let us off the bus, and we boarded the plane, and we flew out to a refugee camp in Cameroon. And from there, all those people came to the U.S., and I've watched them over the past years rebuild their lives, become U.S. citizens, go to college, and build their families here.
What happened to Rose Mapendo?
Rose is speaking publicly. She's an inspiring speaker who speaks for others. She was one of the spokespeople for our organization at the start. Mammy is another spokesperson for our organization. But we found other relatives of hers who had survived and other relatives of some of the other people that came out, and we helped to reunite them with their family members here. So they have a thriving community in Phoenix, Arizona now.
I remember when she first came, she couldn't speak any English, and she would sing, wasn't it?
Yes.
She would sing in the events.
Yes.
Very, very moving. And by the way, Mapendo in Swahili means great love. Yeah, there is a fundamental aspect of your work that is very relevant for me, because I have a foundation, and the mission of the foundation is empowerment of women and girls. You mentioned the girls that were left behind. Usually the poorest of the poor, the most abused and exploited, are women and girls. And I want you to address that, the part of your work that addresses that.
Isabel, this is exactly what I've seen as well, is that as I was starting Refuge Point, I saw that there were many young girls and women who were overlooked and who were forgotten. Those South Sudanese lost girls in Kakuma camp who were overlooked in the resettlement of the lost boys. But then I was working in Nairobi and found that there were many women who had been raped or attacked in refugee camps and were HIV positive and had been ostracized from their communities and fled to the slums of Nairobi, where they were dying and no assistance was there for them. So Refuge Point was started to identify and protect those people. What I see in the humanitarian space is when their programs do not specifically address the needs of girls and women, they overlook them. Because girls and women have particular needs and particular situations, and you can't just create a program that addresses the needs of everybody and think that girls and women's needs and issues will be addressed. So Refuge Point has a specific focus on protecting girls and women and families.
That's really important because in philanthropy, for example, for every dollar spent on women's programs, $20 are spent on men's programs. I understand that 80% of the refugees in the world are women and children. Is that true?
Right now, about 80% of the world's refugees are women and children, but also there are more people displaced by conflict than at any time in history. The latest numbers that just came out on Monday are that 65 million people have fled their homes because of violence and persecution. That's more people than at any point. And another trend that we're seeing is that people are refugees for an average of 20 years. That means when you flee your home, you're not returning home anytime soon. So,
and if you are, your children will not. Because I live that personally. That you get out and 17 years later, when you are allowed back in your country, your children have grown up in some other place and they don't have any connection to the place of origin. So there's no way of going back. You can go back physically, but emotionally, you are always a foreigner, always displaced.
In Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, there are 10,000 children whose grandparents arrived there as refugees 25 years ago. Grandparents. And these are not places where you want to spend even a year. So we actually, as a global community, have to rethink how we address refugee issues. We can't think of people as victims who just need aid endlessly. We have to see them for who they are. People who are entrepreneurs, who have abilities and skills and want to contribute, want to grow and build their families and support their families and become contributing members of society. And we have to open up pathways for that to happen. And that's what Refuge Point is focused on, not giving aid year after year after year in perpetuity. The whole humanitarian system is broke and broken. There's no more money to support the masses of people, but the whole orientation towards emergency aid year after year doesn't work anymore. So Refuge Point is focused on shifting the mindset and bringing organizations and governments and UN agencies together to focus more on solutions for refugees. So more people have pathways to countries where they can rebuild their lives, and more people have pathways to self-reliance opportunities in the countries to which they fled.
Now, the world has seen masses of refugees in Asia, in Africa, in South America for centuries. But now that masses of refugees are reaching the shores of Europe, now we talk about a crisis. And how do you compare the situation of the people you have tried to help with what's happening in Europe?
Many people from the Middle East are trying to get into Europe. Lisa was just in Greece. She's in the audience. She just came back from Greece working with Syrian refugees there. More people have lost their lives trying to cross from Africa into Europe as well. I think this became something that the global community took note of because of the mass migration into Europe. But actually, what we're seeing is this migration is just a symptom of a bigger problem. It's a symptom of the fact that there are the average amount of time is 20 years that someone is a refugee, and there's no more aid to support them. So we saw that this migration started last August after the World Food Program ran out of money. And overnight, 800,000 people didn't have access to any food and faced an impossible choice about whether to watch their families starve or to try to get to someplace safer. So what we have to do as a global community is find more safe migration pathways for people, but also find ways that people can support themselves in the countries to which they've fled. And that takes a shift in mindset.
I'm a storyteller, and I know the power of stories. Do you think that telling personal stories can do more than just statistics and see? What I find is that sometimes we are overwhelmed by the numbers and we can't see a face in the numbers. They're not people, they're just numbers. That's why I was so touched by Rose Mapendo, because that's how we met. You told me about her, and that moved everything for me, because there was a woman with a name.
Yep, I've seen that when refugees isn't really the right word. They're people just like you and me. They're people who've just fled violence and persecution. So many of us have that kind of experience in our family histories. But when people have the voice and the ability to tell their own stories, that moves hearts and minds. When refugees who are here in the US have a chance to speak to others, and when we get to know them as our neighbors and our friends and our fellow students, that's when our perception changes. So stories for me are fundamental in telling the story of Refuge Point and others. But I think also personally, I've found that to build an organization, one of the values or fundamental ways to do that is to tell your own personal story. There's a professor named Marshall Gans who teaches a course called Public Narrative, and he lays out 3 points in that course: self, us, and now. Self meaning tell a story that relates to who you are, that raises issues about yourself and that you can highlight a situation yourself. Us means connect that story with others, with your community, so that you feel that my story can be like you and you resonate and relate with that story. Now means to connect that with the urgency of what's happening today. 65 million people displaced by conflict, but many other people like Mammy in the video, like Rose, others who are there, who need our assistance, but once they have that, they can support themselves and go on to do extraordinary things and change people's hearts and minds. So I've found that telling my story and enabling others to tell stories are fundamental to doing this kind of work.
Well, that's how I got started with you, with the story. Maybe we can open it to the audience. Maybe they have questions. Yes.
Sasha, I have a question about, did you ever talk to any of the 112 people about your decision? And because they didn't have agency in that situation. They were the ones that were being put at risk. So. Yeah.
And maybe I'll just repeat that. So did we talk to the 112 other people, because they didn't have agency in that decision, to get their input around what they thought? We didn't. But in hindsight, I've thought about that. I've thought that I don't think it would have been necessarily so possible in our particular situation. But I have talked to others since then, and they said, absolutely, we would have said that you should try to include those people. These are all family members and relatives, people who knew one another. But I think it's an important point is that when you're facing a hard decision, think about the people who are impacted by that decision. Think of their perspective and what this will mean for them when you're confronted with such dilemmas and situations.
Sasha, do you know the percentage of women and children in the Syrian refugee situation?
The percentage of women and children in the Syrian refugee crisis. So there are about 12 million people. Among the 65 million people displaced by conflict, about 12 million are from Syria. 8 million of those are inside their own country, but they fled their homes, and 4 million approximately have crossed an international border and are considered refugees. The numbers, as far as I understand, are approximately the same. About 80% of those people are women and children.
I don't understand why we're not hearing this. It just seems, I mean, clearly the politics have turned these people into something that they're not. Obviously, we're hearing about them just being this, this plague on our country and so on. But why isn't anyone who's defending our bringing more refugees into the country talking about that statistic? I mean, it seems such an obvious thing to highlight.
Yeah, why aren't people talking about that statistic? Because it's such an obvious thing to highlight. It is. It's so relevant and necessary. President Obama actually in September is going to hold a refugee summit. And in that summit, he's going to talk about the need to increase opportunities for resettlement, increase opportunities for education and access to employment, and increase humanitarian support for these situations, but so we can transition people into self-reliance opportunities.
May I say something?
Please.
When we talk about refugees, we think Africa and we think Syria. What about the refugees we have in this country? People who are fleeing from crime, corruption, poverty, extreme violence, much of that created by the policies of the United States abroad, by supporting military dictatorships that destroyed the country. In Guatemala, 200,000 indigenous people were assassinated by the military, supported by the CIA. Those people, the children and the grandchildren of those people, have nothing in their lives that they can hold on to. They don't have a future, they don't have education, they have a country that is falling apart, a beautiful country, a fantastic country that is falling apart. And so they come to the United States, some of them little children, because there is no hope. Why do you think people leave their country? Why would they leave their country, what is familiar to them, their language, their piece of land, their pets, their grandmothers? Why would they do that unless they are absolutely desperate? But we don't call them refugees. Those are immigrants, illegal aliens. So be careful when we refer to them, and be careful when we talk about immigration in this country.
And Isabel, I think that's such an important point, and what I would relate that to is our own decisions and the things that we can do. When I think about what you just said, I think about the fact that in the late 1970s and 80s, many refugees from Central America were coming into our country, over 1 million people very quickly because of conflict and violence there, and yet for political reasons, our government did not recognize them as refugees and tried to deport them back home where they faced danger. And so Americans took action, and the sanctuary movement was started, where individuals and cities came together to protect those people. So it was people like you and me, but also actually conservative Texans and others who came face to face with these refugees and said, once I've come face to face with these people, I can't turn away. It's my moral obligation to do something. And that's something that's apolitical. It's not something that is either a Democratic or Republican tendency. It's a human characteristic. And so I think that's important.
I don't know if you're aware, but Amnesty International came up with a little program that was done in Germany, apparently. And it's a sort of warehouse. It looks like a warehouse. And people are put in couples at random. And you just sit there and look at the other person in the eye for 4 minutes. And then you see, for example, a woman that is a Muslim woman sitting in front of a redneck, maybe a Nazi German, whatever. And then they look at each other in the eye for 4 minutes, and everything changes. Everything shifts, and they end up embracing. So the thing is, we don't see people in the eye, and we don't see that they are just like us. And it could be us. It could be.
And so it's so important to also have media attention around these issues. The company that made that video that we watched earlier is called Show of Force. A previous global campaign they created was something called Half the Sky with Nick Kristof that was addressing the oppression of women and girls. Their next global campaign is on the refugee crisis, and it's called Humanity on the Move, and they're working on that right now. But the goal is to bring these stories in a human way to us, not just to elicit our sympathy, but to make us understand that these are people just like us, and to help draw people's action to these issues.
There's another question there.
Having friends that family Somali refugees, and speaking with them, that it's really difficult for the mother to talk about the atrocities that she saw fleeing. What has there been talk, or any programs, whether it be in Canada or in the United States, to provide some type of counseling for potential PTSD for these families that are trying to move on with their lives logistically, but also emotionally?
Just to repeat the question, many refugees, you have friends from Somalia, have been through terrible atrocities and can't talk about them. So are there programs that work on counseling to help people with PTSD? It's such an important thing to address. There are some programs, but interestingly, Refuge Point works in Kenya to help refugees through a holistic set of services become self-reliant so that they don't need aid anymore. And we work with many women who have been traumatized. And what we find is that counseling and livelihoods go hand in hand, that people need that counseling support, and often we do group counseling sessions as well, and that gives them the ability, the sense that they can do something and support themselves, and that's what kind of unlocks and enables their efforts to support themselves. So it's a fundamental and important aspect of, I think, humanitarian issues and assistance.
Well, Sasha, thank you so much. As always, you make me cry. From the very beginning. Yeah, and I don't cry easily.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.